Hi, class. If you're looking at a screen, um, there is an image of a quite a beautiful map. And I took this picture at Bucky's. I can't remember what Bucky's it was. I think it might have been the Bucky's between Houston and San Antonio, the one in Luling. Um, I just love Bucky's, as a lot of people do. And it's quite a beautiful map, but it's kind of an odd map in a way. And you might have wondered, why is Texas, the Republic of Texas, why is it this shape? It includes half of New Mexico, including Albuquerque and Santa Fe. It goes up in Colorado, goes all the way really up into Wyoming. And the reason for that is the reason for this shape is in the minds of the many of the founders of Anglo-Texas. And when I'm talking about Anglo-Texas, I'm talking about post 1836 Texas, which was dominated by Anglos. In their minds, this was the shape of the Republic of Texas. The Republic of Texas reached all the way into Wyoming, through New Mexico, present day New Mexico, Colorado, all the way down to Brownsville, because those folks claimed that any area that the Rio Grande went through was owned by Texas. And the Rio Grande, the headwaters of the Rio Grande River, start in Wyoming. So that explains this shape. That again, the folks that took over Texas, basically, with a few exceptions, who were Anglo. This was their imaginary, as we say today. This is their what they claimed belonged to Texas, or this is what they claimed Texas consisted of. So it's, as is often true in Texas history, it's a bold claim. But what we're going to talk about in this part of the course is, while the Republic of Texas could make this claim, it in fact had absolutely no power to enforce it. And one of the things that I want to stress in this part of the course is that the Republic of Texas was a very, very weak entity. Now, one of the things that we Texans like to brag about is that Texas was an independent nation, which is actually true. It was an independent nation from 1836 until 1845, 1836 until 1845, about 9 years, 9 or 10 years. But that was kind of an accident. The reason that Texas was an independent nation was the United States wasn't ready to accept Texas as a state until 1845. If Texans had had their way, the vast majority of Texans, Texas would have been part of the US right after the revolution in 1836. But the US, for reasons I'll explain in the podcast that are coming up, the US just was not ready to accept Texas as a state yet, and wouldn't be until almost 10 years after the Texas Revolution. So by default, Texas becomes a republic. But although it's kind of pretty awesome that Texas was its own independent republic, the fact is that Texas was a weak republic. It was a weak state because it was in debt. It had spent a lot of money gaining its freedom. Texas is still under constant attack by the Comanche. The Comanche haven't gone away yet, and they still dominate West Texas. Texas is actually still under attack by Mexico. As late as 1842, a Mexican army came into San Antonio and occupied it just for a couple of days. But nonetheless, there's constant fighting between Mexico and Texas. And above all, the Republic of Texas is a republic. It's a slave republic. Anglos were very clear about that. They wanted slavery in Texas, but because they wanted to continue to grow cotton, right? This is one of the things that I stressed in the first part of the course. So Texas becomes a slave republic at just the moment where world opinion is turning against slavery. The most powerful nation on earth, for instance, Great Britain, had freed all the slaves that it owned in the Caribbean in the late 1830s. And England became very, very strongly anti-slavery. The British Navy began patrolling off the coast of Africa to suppress the slave trade from Africa. So Great Britain, by far the most powerful nation on earth at this time, has turned abolitionist, anti-slavery, and is, I'll talk about over the next 2 weeks, the anti-slavery position of England is going to play a big role on Texas history because England is the biggest market for Texas cotton. So this is a problem. The other thing is that Texas is a republic almost wholly dependent. There's still some cattle industry in Texas, but it's a republic that economically is dependent on one crop, cotton. And the problem with being dependent on an economy, or one commodity rather, is that cotton, the price of cotton would rise and fall. And Texas was completely dependent on the fact that cotton was profitable, which at times it was. But in 1837, the year after Texas became an independent republic, there was a huge depression in the United States. And of course, Texas is, although it's not officially part of the United States, its economy is very much tied up into the US economy. Most of the Anglos that are coming into Texas are, of course, from the United States. And when the US economy tanks in 1837, the price of cotton drops, and that's going to affect Texas too. So cotton was a two-edged sword for Texas. It was a commodity that was greatly desired globally, but at the same time, the price of cotton wasn't steady. It could rise at times, but at times it could fall. And this made Texas kind of a weak republic economically. The fact that it wasn't diverse, that it really depended on cotton and the price of cotton in an economy where the price of cotton could rise and fall. As I'll talk about, the big losers in the post-revolutionary Texas are Tejanos. Mexicans, Texans of Mexican descent, Spanish descent, Mexican descent. They had ruled Texas until April of 1836. Suddenly, they're seen as outsiders, a suspect people. A lot of Anglos believe that Tejanos are working with slaves to help slaves run away to Mexico. And remember, in Mexico, slavery is illegal. So if you were a slave and you get to Mexico, you gained your freedom. So one of the quirks of Texas history is that it was the only southern state, the only slave state where slaves went south instead of north. They went into Mexico to gain their freedom. There's a lot of hostility between Anglos and Tejanos. As I'll talk about, Tejanos lose political rights, they lose their civil rights, their judicial rights. For African Americans in Texas, the situation pretty much remains the same. They're still enslaved. What's different, though, is now all the barriers are off, and folks can come into the US, into Texas, and bring their slaves with no trouble whatsoever. Texas welcomes slaves in the post-1836 period. So what you have is the amount of slaves in Texas goes up from 1836 until 1860, when the Civil War starts. By 1860, there are 186,000 slaves in Texas, an enormous growth in the number of slaves coming into Texas. So slavery takes off in Texas. And of course, why is this? because of the close association between cotton and slavery, because cotton production also takes off in Texas as well, now that the brakes are off. So the Republic of Texas is a much more complicated, it has a much more complicated history than we often remember. And in fact, one of my mantras of this course is the Republic of Texas is much more powerful in memory than it was in reality. In reality, it was a very weak nation. It was beset by debt. It was beset by all kinds of enemies, native enemies, the Comanche especially. There's still fighting going on with Mexico. It's dependent on one crop, a crop that the price goes up and down, is not steady. And ultimately, when Texas becomes part of the United States in 1845, there is a huge sigh of relief on behalf of most Anglos in Texas. Because once Texas becomes part of the United States, it becomes part of a much more powerful entity than it ever could have been on its own. It's the US Army ultimately that's going to suppress the Indians. The US Army comes in and starts a war in the late 1840s with Mexico that guarantees the Rio Grande will be the southern border of Texas. So it's not until Texas joins the United States really that its independence is guaranteed. So this is the story that I'm going to be tracing out over the next couple of weeks. And although this map is quite beautiful, and it'd be awesome if Albuquerque and Santa Fe were, and eastern Colorado and parts of Wyoming were still part of Texas. The reality, even though Texans claimed all this land, the reality is far more complex and a lot less dramatic. Texas is still kind of that rump area of what is now East Texas that it had been during the Spanish and Mexican period.